Reading from Esther. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, as they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me. That is my petition. And the lives of my people, that is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace. But no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king." Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he who has presumed to do this?" Esther said, "A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king rose from the feast in wrath and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that the king had determined to destroy him. When the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman had thrown himself on the couch where Esther was reclining. And the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" As the words left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Look, the very gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, stands at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the anger of the king abated. This is the word of the Lord.
It's been said that nearly all men can stand adversity. But if you want to test a man's character, give him power. As you know, the Pope came to the United States this week, perhaps the most powerful religious figure in the world, coming to the most powerful nation in the world. It's the first time that the Pope had come and spoken to a joint Congress, and he made it count, talking about religious liberty, social justice, and the transcendent dignity of the human being. In his opening comments to Congress, he challenged them to do what's best for the common good and enable the country to grow. He said, "A political society endures when it seeks as a vocation to satisfy common needs by stimulating the growth of all its members, especially those in situations of greater vulnerability or risk. Legislative activity is always based on care for people." What's so great about Pope Francis is he said these words, these beautiful words, and he didn't just leave it there. He put his own words and his own challenge to Congress into practice. He chose to forego lunch with lawmakers to have lunch with 300 homeless people. The Pope could eat wherever he wants. He could eat whatever he wants, with whomever he wants. This action of eating with homeless people seems to go against our perceptions of what people in power do. Oftentimes when we think of people who are in power, we think of people with money, with influence, who throw their power around to benefit themselves. People who worked hard to get where they are. We think of people like the President of the United States, an executive in a large corporation, a school administrator, a pastor of a church. There's no doubt that these people in these high positions have power, But when you really think about who has power, we all do. We all have people that look at our lives who we influence. We may say some crazy things, but for some reason, no matter how crazy the things people say, some people follow them. Think of people like David Koresh, Jim Jones, Charles Manson, Hitler. These guys had a bunch of people following them, and they were crazy. It's hard to believe that people with such radical beliefs could have so much power, but they do. So what's interesting about power is the issue is not having it, but the issue is how we obtain it and what we do with it. Do we gain power by forcing our beliefs on other people? Do we obtain power by threatening people with their jobs? Do we gain power by manipulating people's emotions? Or do we gain power by doing what is right? By serving others, doing what's best for the whole rather than for me? The irony of power is that power packs more punch when we empower rather than overpower. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't think of ourselves when we make decisions, but we think about how we can best go about making decisions that benefit all people rather than us. The irony of power is all over the book of Esther. All over the book of Esther, there's power plays going on, people throwing their power around. King Ahasuerus, also called Xerxes, which is a lot easier to say, by the way, is king of Persia. Queen Vashti gets deposed because she won't do exactly what the king says. He says, "Come here," and she says no, and she gets not to be queen anymore. So all the women come around. Esther hears about it. She goes to see the king, and she gets chosen. She is the orphaned cousin of Mordecai. And so now Esther is in this great position. She hears some people, or Mordecai hears some folks of the king plotting to kill him. So Mordecai tells the king, which gets Mordecai in good standing. And the king has the two men killed. Well, this sets up Haman to become the right-hand man for the king. And that power of being the right-hand man to the king went straight to Haman's head. All the king's servants bowed down to him and shook in their boots when he walked by, except for Mordecai. And that just crawled all over Haman's skin. He had everything he wanted. Everybody bowed down to him except for one person, and it infuriated him. So Haman begins to think, what can I do to solve this problem of Mordecai? And because he was so powerful, he thought it beneath him to handle Mordecai alone. So he decides to just kill all the Jews in Persia to make it better. He goes to Xerxes and says, "Hey, I've got a plan. This is what we should do. These Jews, they're not obeying the laws of the king." And so Xerxes, being a gutless wonder, gives the literal seal of approval with his signet ring. Letters are sent out all over Persia. And there was one day where the slaughtering of the Jews was going to take place. Mordecai finds out again. This time he tells Esther, and she tells the king. But what's strange about this is Esther is putting her life at risk. Because Esther, if she goes before the king and he doesn't reach out his golden scepter, she could be killed immediately. Fortunately for Esther, she was quite good looking, and the king was a pushover, so when she approached him, he said, "Come see me." This is where we find ourselves in the story today. Esther risked her life when she could have just sat back in her comfort. She's meeting with the king and Haman in her second banquet, standing up for the Jews, the people who were already exiled, the people who have already been persecuted for their beliefs, the people who are about to be destroyed. Haman is using his power to gain more power, to power over people rather than to empower people. And that drive for power that consumed him ended up killing him on his own gallows. When power is demanded, coerced, or manipulated, it isn't power at all. True power comes when we use our positions of power to benefit and empower others, even if it means less benefit for us. Esther is using her power as queen to stand up for her fellow Jews. She risks her life to go before the king, have a banquet. She could have stayed in her life of luxury, having manicures and pedicures all day long, getting massages and having her hair fixed with a personal stylist, having jewelry abound. She risks all of that in her life for the Jews. When power is used for the good of the whole, it inspires rather than stifles. It encourages rather than discourages. It speaks up rather than remaining silent. It unifies rather than divides, and it embraces what is different rather than being afraid of what is different. We live in a time in our history where we can easily be seduced into thinking that we're in a good spot just because we've come a long way. We can choose to settle with where we've come, or we can choose to stand up and speak up against the injustices that still exist in our world, in our country, and even our churches. It's so easy for us to just sit back and enjoy lives of luxury. It's simple. It's comfortable. It keeps us safe. But when you think about it, sitting back when doing nothing is about the most unchristian and ungodly thing we can do. Speaking of unchristian, has anyone noticed I haven't used the word God yet in this sermon? But what's interesting is the book of Esther never mentions the word of God. God is not mentioned. So why is this book with this story about power in our Bible, this powerful book we have, if it doesn't even mention the word about God, who this book is in fact about? One could be, earlier in the story, Mordecai tells Esther, Esther, perhaps you're here in such a time as this. Maybe God has, implying that God has put her in this situation. But maybe it's also because it's a great example of how God works in our lives, in our world today. The Spirit of God is on the move, ridding the world of racism, bringing justice to victims of injustice, bringing peace and hope to those of us who are brokenhearted, loving instead of hating, sacrificing rather than living comfortably. There are events taking place all over Dallas and the world that may not even have the name of God or Jesus attached, but the people who are doing the acts of justice are still being used by God. We see the irony of power once again. God is not powerful because He forces Himself on people. God is not powerful because He makes people do things. God is powerful because God empowers us to participate with Him in God's kingdom. God works behind the scenes to let the Spirit move in people's lives to accomplish the goal of making earth look a little bit more like heaven each day we live. Isn't that why we have a relationship with God? Isn't that why we follow Jesus? To partner with God? To help God bring His kingdom here? Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, came from heaven to earth to show us how to love one another. He performed miracles and healed the sick, hung out with sinners. He even gave up eating with the religious powers of the day to eat with homeless people. Jesus was God incarnate. He could have had anything He wanted. He had all the power in the universe and chose to empower people to serve people rather than be served. Jesus is not some God who is sitting up in an ivory tower, commanding us every little move to make and threatening us when we mess up. God, Jesus, is a God of the people. People follow Jesus because He's with us, walking beside us as we live our lives, offering peace and love and grace, washing our feet, offering forgiveness, even when failure is imminent. Jesus chose to use His power to benefit all of humankind. Because of His great love for us, He died so that we could live. As followers of Christ, we are called to use the power that God has given us to benefit the common good, not just what benefits us or our families. We are to go where God goes, to lead how God leads, and to serve the way Jesus served. There was an example of this in the Dallas Morning News recently. Sam Tasby, a late civil rights leader, he was a pioneer in Dallas who was having an elementary school named after him. Tasby, who died August 16th, was the main plaintiff in a 1970 lawsuit against Dallas ISD that empowered a federal court to halt policies of racial segregation in the district. This happening 16 years after the Supreme Court ruled the practice was unconstitutional. When Tasby was asked what he did to merit the honor, he said, I didn't do anything. So the reporter pressed a little bit more and tried to figure out what he did, and he just said, I did nothing. I just did what was right. Paul Zavalos, the school's first principal, said Tasby was at the heart of the school community, appearing at dances, Black History Month events, Cinco de Mayo celebrations, and other functions. He was with the students. Zavalos said he was just always available, always there, wanted to do whatever he could for the school. Tasby could have remained silent, but he chose to speak up in this lawsuit that ended segregation. It was possible that he would have never seen the benefit, but yet education, racial equality was so important to him that he couldn't remain silent. He chose to do what was right, and as a result, the schools were integrated. He was 93 years old when the school was named after him. He could have just sat back and basked in the glory of his name on that school. He could have used it to his advantage, gloating about it. But he simply chose to make himself available. Jesus made himself available to us, using his power to bring heaven to earth. May we use the power we've received to empower others so that they can have the abundant life that we have. Esther had power. Sam Tasby had power. Jesus has power. You have power. Use your power to bring heaven to earth, because perhaps you are here for such a time as this. Amen.